Our speakers tonight had long, distinguished, and globe-spanning careers in the United States State Department. Many of you are familiar with Christopher Hill. Julie and Christopher Hill, the Vail Symposium could expect no better friends or supporters. They've been involved with us for a number of years. We did a program with Christopher Hill last August, and it was really our honor to bring him back again. He is, as a reminder, was an ambassador to 4 countries: Macedonia, Poland, South Korea, and Iraq. He was the head of the U.S. delegation to the 6-party talks on the North Korea nuclear issue, the dean of the Korbel School of International Affairs. He is currently at Columbia University's School of International Studies and International Affairs. So we welcome both Ambassador Christopher Hill, and we did a program a couple of years ago, some of you may have attended. Ambassador Hill was in conversation with another ambassador, and it was really an excellent program. So we thought, let's try to find another ambassador, and our folks at the World Affairs Council recommended Ambassador Gary Grappo. He was the envoy and head of mission of the Office of the Quartet Representative, the Honorable Tony Blair, in Jerusalem. He also held senior positions at our embassies in Baghdad as well as in Riyadh, and he was our ambassador to Oman. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Center for Middle East Studies at the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. We're so honored to have Ambassador Christopher Hill and Ambassador Gary Grappo join us this evening. Please help me welcome them.
All right, well, good evening, and let me say, what a pleasure to see a real audience here. I mean, I don't mean you weren't real on Zooms and stuff like that, but this is really the way it ought to be, and so real honor. I know it's been a long time, the U.S., and frankly, it's continuing in the world, so we all have to, continue to be safe, but it's such a pleasure to see you all here, and to see that the Vail Symposium, I mean, neither snow nor rain nor dark of night nor a global pandemic keeps the Vail Symposium down. So I think we've been very, very impressed, Claire, with how you and Chris and others have kept things going here, because the world never stopped, and we're going to talk about some of those issues tonight. Gary and I go back. We served together in Iraq, and we've both been sort of grizzled veterans of the Foreign Service, and we've both taught students here at Korbel, and about if you want to make a difference, go out there and find a career. There are no home runs in foreign policy. It's usually just a long slog, but I think the students have increasingly understood that issues, if they thought things were going to go away and never come back, well, there are a lot of problems that continue out there, and they're not going to find that as they enter careers that there will be nothing to do. There'll be plenty to do. So I thought we're going to talk about a bunch of sort of hardy perennials out there. I mean, it would be a terrible night if you couldn't talk about North Korea. I mean, you just want to pick them up and hug them, So we'll talk about that. Gary, who has just tremendous experience in the Middle East and other places, will talk about Iran, I think, and we got to talk about our old stomping grounds, Iraq, as well.
Absolutely.
I think it's important to talk about where we're going, where the new administration is going with NATO allies. We have allies around the world, and I think this is an administration that's very dedicated to the proposition that we need friends and allies out there, and so we'll probably talk about where we are there, and then we'll talk, I think, the big issue that for many people is so worrisome, whether left or right. I mean, it was certainly true in the Trump administration, it's true in the Biden administration, is the question of China, and whether our relationship with China. So, and of course, Vladimir Putin, Yeah, he's always good for some.
Another huggable.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So I think, Gary, what do you think? Should we get going?
Yeah, let's get going. I also want to just express my thanks for being here, and to all of you, certainly to all the sponsors and donors for this great event. I'm, like Chris, a strong believer in informing the American citizen. I think events like this go a long way toward doing that. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be up here and take a stab at doing that on our behalf. So with that, why don't we dive into some of these great issues?
Yeah. Well, where would you like to start? Should we start in the Middle East? Because, remember during the Obama administration, there's a lot of talk, we're going to pivot, we're going to get away from this thing, and we're going to do other things that are more important, more central to our interests over time. But there seems to be a sort of thing where you're pulled back from the Middle East. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about another old hardy perennial, but which is, I think, kind of back in some vogue, and that is the Arab-Israel issue.
Sure. Well,
and tell us what a quartet is, too.
Yeah, I'll cover that.
Yeah.
I often describe the Middle East as America's Hotel California. I tried to check out 6 times, and there I was with Chris in Baghdad. And then when I thought I was done there, I got sucked into Jerusalem. And when I went to first call on Tony Blair, it was just before the UN General Assembly, and he said, "You just got out of Baghdad, right?" "Yes, I did." He said, "And you're going to take on the Israelis and the Palestinians." This is probably not an area of the world where the United States can walk away from, despite a lot of public sentiment that it's probably about time that we do. We have too many interests, too many friends, and too many alliances. And so, for better or worse, we're going to be there. Not in the same way we have been in the past. At some point, I think, and Chris would probably agree with this, we moved away from the focus on addressing the region's many, many problems using diplomacy, occasionally with military force, but diplomacy, to an overemphasis on the use of our armed forces. And ultimately, at least in my own view, it has created this sense of the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. And so much of the attention in Washington is given to the armed forces and their ability to affect change or not, and less toward diplomacy. And it's diplomacy that really is the only solution to the manifold problems of the Middle East today. And the Israeli-Palestinian issue is probably the most indicative of that. I know that this administration would like to diminish the focus on the Israeli-Palestinian problem simply because the conditions are nowhere near what they would need to be on either side in order to get the two sides into a room and discuss constructively what needs to be done.
Well, let me ask, the Trump administration took an approach that said, okay, this does look like an intractable issue, but let's try to establish diplomatic relations among Arab states with Israel, and could this calm the situation down, and could it lead to eventual solutions? So they were not successful with some of the central players in the Middle East, but they were successful with Sudan. They were successful with Morocco. They were successful in the United Arab Emirates. So I guess the question I would ask you as someone who has followed these things, is this something worth pursuing from the Biden administration? That is, look at diplomatic relations, try to get the Saudis into this, try to get others, more central players into it, and somehow this will lead to some lessening of tensions toward a solution or something.
The short answer is yes. And the United States has always wanted to see normalization of Arab-Israeli ties. We really haven't given its due. And I think when the Trump administration saw that it simply couldn't get out of the dugout, much less to first base on bringing any kind of a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem, they started pushing on what now has become an open door. Arab governments are no longer going to hold their foreign policies, their economic interests, hostage to Palestinian interests, and they're moving ahead. We saw that with the 4 countries who have now normalized ties. I have some reservations about Morocco and the trade-off that was involved there. We basically gave away Western Sahara in contradiction to standing U.S. policy.
In UN policy.
And
I mean,
UN
every
policy.
country in the world was saying the Western Sahara should await an overall
Exactly. And we
solution.
sold out the 700,000 people of the Western Sahara. And similarly, in the case of Sudan, you have a transitional government in place right now. They just deposed this dictator who was convicted in the International Criminal Court in The Hague for multiple human rights violations. They have a transition government to get them to elections. And so they formed a united front among the various civil society organizations and so forth to hold these elections, ensure that they're democratic, and we forced them prematurely to making a very, very difficult foreign policy decision by withholding money that they needed once they basically acknowledged their responsibility for multiple terrorist attacks in the past. Yeah. But nevertheless, none of these countries have ever been at war with Israel. It's important to point out. It's not a peace treaty. It's normalization, diplomatic ties. And I think the Biden administration is going to move forward aggressively as well. There are a few other potential candidates out there.
And I mean, as someone who's really dealt with this, day by day, we have Bibi Netanyahu probably not coming back, although I don't know that. But so how does the switch from Netanyahu to Bennett affect Israel's willingness to work these issues?
Most definitely, the Israeli government is going to have a better relationship and a less polarizing relationship with the U.S. government writ large. I think the Israeli government knows that it needs to repair its relationship with the Democratic Party, which historically has been the stronger supporter of Israeli interests. So they'll be working.
So Bennett will pay more attention then
definitely pay more attention, and will probably put a lot less pressure on this administration when it comes to things like settlements, potential annexation, although I think that was pretty much off the possibility. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of movement. It's more or less repair work and looking at some of the internal work that needs to be done both within Israel and within Palestinian territories. I will finally add that what sort of threw the administration off was, once again, and depending on how you count, it would be either the 6th or the 9th eruption of a war between Gaza and Israel. And sadly, it's probably not the last. The Hamas has proven itself extremely resilient and resourceful, and will probably be able to acquire the wherewithal to arm itself and again challenge Israel. But for the time being, it sort of threw the administration off track when it came to the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it forced the administration to do something that probably wasn't ready to do but had to do, and that is reach out to countries where we have a bit of a sensitive relationship like Egypt and Qatar to help put that the Hamas violence back into the box. But this is only temporarily. Only temporarily.
We could go on because there's the question of the whole approach of a two-state solution supported by many presidents, not supported by the last president. Biden has indicated he wants to get back to the two-state solution, but I think, as you mentioned, you need someone to negotiate with, and we don't seem to have that right now. If I were the administration right now and looking at various negotiations, I would like to plunge into with the idea of that they're going to take time and they're going to take real effort, and that is the issue with Iran, which is, on another side of the Middle East. And by the way, the third issue I think we ought to talk about in the Middle East is it's the South Asia really, is the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I know that the administration is looking at the Iran issue with a view to seeing if we can get back to the joint plan of action, the JCPOA. And the question is, right now it's been difficult and they're trying to do it very slowly, but the expectation was that that this administration would understand that the reason one of the reasons JCPOA didn't really work during the Obama administration was the fact that we have seen misbehavior, if you will, from the Iranians all over the Middle East, all over Sunni areas in the Middle East, and very aggressive in Syria, very overt intervention. In Iraq, we see the Shia militia groups, often supported by Iran, and that support has never decreased, despite the decision to take Qasem Soleimani off the board, President Trump's decision to have him essentially assassinated. But they have the Quds Force, the Iranian Islamic militias have been quite willing to continue to back these Iraqi Shia groups. So we're not seeing anything there. Originally, the problem was other signatories of the JCPOA, the French, the Brits, etc., said, we cannot get into this regional stuff. We'd have to bring the Saudis in. We'd have to bring a lot of players in. And before you know it, we wouldn't really make the progress on the nuclear talks. I think the Biden administration goes in with a view that may be true, but this time we better address some of these issues, Iranian mischief. And we do so at a time when the Iranian government is even more Islamicized than the previous government. Now, there's this old issue of, who can go to China, and usually, it's the answer is Richard Nixon. Well, they don't have Richard Nixon, but they have some equivalents there. And so there is an argument that maybe they're the right people to deal with, but I don't see it happening, and I think, like a lot of great ideas, we may be back to seeing if we can put that nuclear genie back in the bottle.
This is going to be far more difficult than I think the administration had anticipated because of the results of the most recent election, in which a very conservative cleric was elected as a new president, and he takes office next month. Now, it's pretty easy to win an election when all your more competitive opponents are screened out and whose names are prohibited from showing up on the ballot.
You say they've had some voter suppression in Iran lately, something like that? Yeah.
And candidate suppression.
Yeah.
Basically, anyone who looked like they might legitimately contest the election against, we're talking about Ibrahim Raisi, who's held just about every position you can hold in the Iranian government, starting from the judge and executioner of Iranians after the Iran-Iraq War in 1988. Iranians claim that he has thousands of lives for which he's responsible, summary executions. So he's held every job. He's rumored to be the top candidate for supreme leader when the current one, Ali Khamenei, leaves the scene. We don't know, of course, when that's going to happen. But so he had no real competition. Well, what is worth noting is the election turnout was the worst they've seen since the '79 revolution. And when you take out the ballots that were invalidated because they voted for no one, people were afraid that if they did not go to the polling places, they'd be penalized in their jobs or in their ability to get subsidies and things of that nature.
Yeah.
And so they handed in blank ballots, which are invalidated. And so it turns out they probably had less than a 40% turnout, which is the worst they've ever had. In the elections that for Rouhani, they had 70% turnout. So Iranians had already expressed their point of view before the election was ever held, and they're not pleased with the result.
Yeah.
And this is going to complicate the election, the negotiation for Mr. Biden and his team. In some ways, the Iranians need this far more. In fact, there's no question. They need this agreement far more. The sanctions have been far more punishing than anyone had ever anticipated because the United States invoked secondary sanctions, basically prohibiting anybody from doing any business with Iran with the penalty of being shut out from the U.S. financial system, which no mid-sized business or bank or higher can afford to do. And so they need this. But I think Mr. Biden has a taller task here because he not only has to sell a persuasive deal to our P5+1 negotiating allies, that's France, Britain, Germany, China, and Russia, and the EU, that's number one. Number two is our regional allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel in particular, who have a real dog in this fight. They're very much concerned about the malign influence or the militia activity throughout the region, ballistic missiles that Iran keeps testing and firing. So they are very much interested in the outcome of this. And then ultimately, if this administration is to avoid the trap that the Obama administration fell into and have this agreement outlast Mr. Biden's administration, be it one or two terms, he's going to have to convince the U.S. Congress and ultimately the American people.
Yeah. I think the Iranians, prior to our election, were interested in the following. They were prepared to take the pledges of no nukes and put it into law, put it into the the parliament and put those pledges into law. That doesn't help a lot, but it's at least something. They were prepared to take some of the expiration dates and push them out and make them forever. They were not prepared, however, to meet the U.S. side because they said, we had a deal, the U.S. agreed to it, we agreed to it, and we're not going to meet and then renegotiate the deal. So it would have been a kind of complex issue where they do some unilateral things while we do some unilateral things and avoid any perception that these things happen through a subsequent negotiation. This all seems kind of juvenile. I mean, if you're willing to do that, why don't you do it? Can't you, why do you worry so much whether meeting? But I think it speaks to the fact that even brutal Islamic governments also have their politics. And I think the view among, a large portion of Iranians, a very hard line, is they shouldn't be talking to a country that did not fulfill or did not continue to fulfill its objectives. That said, and I got this because I was in New York, and this was, time flies when you're having a pandemic, but I think this was back in 2019. And I met with Javad Zarif, and he told me he was prepared to do it. The French had a concept that they would take what the Iranians were prepared to do and kind of hold it in escrow as the U.S. would prepare to do something, and then by, in effect, holding it in holding the payment, if you will, in escrow, they could then say, okay, the two sides are going to do this. We're not there yet. We're clearly not there yet, and I'm not sure where Javad Zarif is right now because I'm not sure he's in like Flint with this new crowd. So I think it's going to take a big effort to get through this. And I think meanwhile, the Biden administration is looking at an enormous issue in the Middle East, and that is the decision, which I for now has bipartisan support in this country, to pull our troops out of Afghanistan. And I think that is going to be, as we see more and more signs of the Taliban taking over whole swaths of territory without even a fight, and there will be a question. I mean, my sense is that Kabul will hold and a few other large urban areas will hold, but we don't know for how long. And I think any president presiding over a time when people are, leaving on helicopters from the roof of the embassy, many of us remember those days, I think it's going to be very difficult for this administration to stand by and have this happen, despite the high polling numbers that suggest that Americans of all parties really think 20 years is enough.
If the administration were to reflect and think, okay, we're almost at some point where we'd be more comfortable to withdraw, what would that be?
Yeah, exactly. And one would have hoped that the Afghan forces, to which we have contributed billions and maybe $1 trillion at this point, would have stood and fought. And that's a brutal judgment because they simply don't see our support. So I know there are negotiations. I suspect, the Taliban, as I used to see in the Balkans a lot, they are not a well-oiled machine where they work together. They have all kinds of different groups. And I think they can get a locus of opinion from the Taliban that would not try to bring the situation back to where we began in the 1990s. Nonetheless, I think there's going to, I think revenge is probably the biggest motivator for some of these conflicts, and I think it's going to be really tough in Afghanistan.
Three groups I think we have to be concerned about are certainly women and girls, and journalists and civil society.
Yeah.
Will come under. They've already faced killings, kidnappings, and so forth. And then refugees. When the war erupted, when we invaded in 2001, we began to see refugees move out of Afghanistan. And if it appears as though the Taliban is hell-bent on reinstituting the kind of government that they had when we invaded in the early 2000s, I think we'll see even greater exodus of refugees. And this has got to be on the minds of the countries of the region, who so far had stood on the sidelines, with the exception of Pakistan, which has aided and abetted actively and almost openly the Taliban. So we'll need to watch that. That'll be probably the first indicator, without any troop movement, going into Kabul.
I would mention even a fourth group, a subset of the refugees, and that is, over the years, thousands of Afghans have worked with us.
Yeah.
And we certainly saw this in Iraq as we were ramping down the number of troops. When we were there, in fact, we went from 144,000 to about 50,000, and then a year and a half later to 0. And so the concern you have are people who've actually worked for you, whether as drivers, interpreters, whatever. This is real human stuff, because you know these people. And they have families, and they have extended families, and it behooves you to do something about it. It was a problem for us in Vietnam, a huge problem, because those pictures of people getting on helicopters, often they did not include the Vietnamese. So we saw it in Iraq, and we're seeing it, and we're going to see more of it in Afghanistan. And this speaks to the fact that when you get into these things, it's a lot easier to get into these things than to get out of these things. And so the problem of getting in with a kind of unclear idea of when you can get out, and get out in circumstances that not only have honor but also have some modicum of success, It's going to be very difficult. I think President Biden is pretty much committed to this. He has seen it firsthand. I mean, he used to come to see us in Iraq a lot. He would go on for a visit to Afghanistan. He knows precisely that despite billions of dollars, it was not taking. It was not working in Afghanistan. And he fought that fight. I remember he used to tell us about it because he'd come out of meetings in Washington and he would be arguing with the generals who would say, we need more time, we just need a little more time. And he said, you know, it's not going to work.
That was in 2010.
That was in 2010, yeah. And so I think he's made a decision, no, I'm not going to throw good after bad, and we're going to do something about this. But it's not going to be pleasant as these months go by.
I think in the end he made a very, very difficult decision. I don't know any person who would not be conflicted now with what we face there. But that what more could the United States do in the next year or 2 years, or in 5 years, that we have not done in the last 20.
Yeah.
And we had just reached that point. Just like Alexander the Great, the British, and the Russians. And we're leaving. But Chris, we touched on the nuclear issue on Iran. Let's move over to your favorite person in the whole wide world, who is now down from a hefty 300 to 240 pounds, really looking trim.
Actually, he was 340, and he's down to 300.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's right. He's got a ways to go.
He's still in the super heavyweight class.
Yes, yeah. Kim Jong-un is when he came up, I remember there was a lot of, first of all, his father, Kim Jong-il, who had been groomed for leadership in turn by his father, Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung used to take Kim Jong-il around, and people kind of got the impression that this very not ready for prime time player was going to take over, and people kind of knew it. But when Kim Jong-il became Kim Jong very ill at a certain point, and I mean, it was, we knew, we were talking, and this was the summer of '08, and we realized we weren't getting answers, and we knew that something had happened, and then the rumors of a very serious stroke. And, our docs in the CIA and elsewhere, it's hard to look at a person on television and kind of do an accurate diagnosis, but they were saying this isn't going to go on for long. They were pretty confident that he was in some trouble. She still didn't bring Kim Jong-un out and sort of show that he had a succession. So along comes this Kim Jong-un who, at first, there was, first of all, the thought that, well, maybe he's a reformer because after all, he's gone to school in Switzerland. And but he was a day student. They'd drop him off and pick him up at night. So, who knows? But there was a lot of talk about whether he was going to be a reformer or not. I talked to a Korean friend of mine in his now he's in his late 80s. He was in his late 70s at the time, and I said, his name was Mike Son. And I said, what do you think? He takes a paper out, he points at the face of Kim Jong-un, and he says, just tell me, do you think this looks like a reformer to you? And he was right, because the first thing we saw were a round of executions, very brutal. I mean, really even brutal for North Korean terms. I mean, this was happening pretty early on. People would be summoned to these executions. The victims were, killed with an anti-aircraft round through their chest, and there wasn't much left of them. I mean, this was a brutal guy. And then we could see that the economy was going badly, and that's when he started to say things that some people interpreted as meaning reform. That is, we should not ask our people to tighten their belts anymore. He certainly wasn't at the time, and so I'm sorry, all those awful jokes, but I mean, he's just a terrible person. I can't resist. So
it's okay.
Yes, sorry about that. But anyway. So there was a thought, well, maybe something could be done. Maybe there could be some approach. The Obama administration, very weary, frankly, of doing that, found that when they tried something, it just didn't work. Even low stakes, it didn't work. So basically, not a lot was done during the Obama administration. Then the Trump administration came in, and I think too often they took the view, whatever our predecessors did, we'll do the opposite. So rather than be very standoffish and try to, work with the South Koreans and work with the Chinese on North Korea, and I'll get to China on that because that's a key element of the equation here, the President Trump decided, I will do it all. I'll do it by myself. And he goes to Singapore. It's a summit that was poorly prepared. And when two presidents, any politician at that level, you don't have to be a North Korean or you don't have to be an American, but any president anyone at that level skates on a very thin fact base. And so you better have things kind of tied down in various agreements that they've been over and they know what's going to happen. They had this meeting in Singapore, nothing really happened. There was some indication the North Koreans were pursuing it, but as someone had listened to them before, I knew we were nowhere on this. Later on, they went to Hanoi, and there was some hope in Hanoi because the North Koreans said, we'll get rid of our main nuclear reactor at Yongbyon. And, I mean, as a negotiator, I hate to criticize people from 10,000 miles away. I don't know the details, but all I know is we rejected it and left within a few hours. I mean, I would have said, you're getting rid of all of Yongbyon. And I would have said, okay, let's unfurl a big map of Yongbyon and tell us what you're doing with building 1 and tell us what you're doing with building 2, and because there are about 98 buildings on them. And I would have tried to get some sense of, well, we're getting rid of that one, we're going to keep that because that's where we do, I don't know, we have cows and milk or something there, and just get some intel out of this. And I think one of the big problems with the Trump administration is when you don't know details, you often don't know the things you really want. They're not necessarily the things you're asking for publicly, but we needed people on the ground to understand these things. Never got anywhere. So to make a long story short, in comes the Biden administration. And meanwhile, North Korea clearly has intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are way ahead of the Iranians. I mean, the Iranians are nowhere close to the North Koreans, and that's one thing people need to understand. Iran has not developed nuclear weapons. They've certainly never tested them. They've never come close to try to miniaturize designs to put them on a missile. They're just nowhere close to the North Koreans. The North Koreans have done all of this stuff. So I think the Biden administration looked at it and basically had a kind of, let's tread water on this for a while, and let's try to see what we can do on Iran, which I think it will be the effort on denuclearization. Iran is not nearly as far, and maybe they could patch up JCPOA. I mean, Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham will never be happy, but maybe they can get something done, and then if there's any momentum from that, they can turn back to the North Korean question. I think the problem with the North Korean question as pursued by the Trump administration was unilateralism. It was all about us. And so half the world says, well, the US isn't really doing enough, when frankly, I think the Chinese have to be at the table, the South Koreans, the Japanese, et cetera, even the Russians. And so I would hope that with respect to this icy relationship we have with China right now, and an icy relationship that I must say is very much part of what China's been doing, and we can talk a lot about what China's been doing, but there's a sea change in the way people view China in the region. And so I think if we can at least try to find some patterns of cooperation, try to find some areas rather than stare at the Chinese like we're having, some kind of unsuccessful marriage counseling, but rather, look at some aspects of things that we can work with them on. I mean, after all, the Chinese are one of the 5 nuclear states in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have no interest in North Korea having nuclear capabilities. So I think at least we should start talking with them and having a serious and continuing, because I think the Trump administration did some of it and the Biden administration is continuing to do it with the South Koreans. And I think there could be some
Chris,
way forward.
We've seen a real change in the way the Chinese look at not only themselves, but their role in the world. They've become far more assertive, even aggressively.
Yeah.
So over the last 5-6 years, what accounts for this change? And what is it the Chinese are after?
Yeah, I think what accounts for it is, I think, the fact that their political system is failing. Their economy is not failing. And anyone who counts out China economically, I mean, these are people who know how to make stuff. And I think they're doing fine. But I think to a great extent they've done it in spite of their political system. So they make a virtue of their political system and try to claim that this political system, which is deeply flawed, is somehow part and parcel of why they've had a successful economy. So they start selling a model. And the model is based on the idea that authoritarianism works, and this is why they have a successful economy. We have, I think, spent too much time telling the world why the Chinese model is wrong, and by the way, it is wrong, and not enough time fixing our model to suggest that our model is a better model. There is nothing more powerful than the example that you can propose. So instead, we have, I think, too often talked about all the failures they have, and needless to say, the Chinese have kind of reacted poorly to that. That said, I must say, China has not only touted what to me is a deeply flawed model, but they've also, I think, been rather rough on some of their neighbors. On my watch, the Vietnamese were very unhappy with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese used to tell American firms, you want to work on our oil sector or the Vietnamese oil sector, and if you're going to work with the Vietnamese, we don't want you, we'll get someone else to work with us. And those are pretty tough words, and the Vietnamese complained to me personally about it. And I said to the Vietnamese, outrageous, et cetera. I had a lot of sympathy, but how can we help? And they said, you really can't. We know you can't really help, but we want you to be aware of this. So it was kind of
century-old tension.
Yeah, centuries, yeah. So they're basically saying, look, Americans, we just want you to know, and stay close, but we're not asking. If you go see a Vietnamese today, I mean, they have their arms wrapped around your pant leg as you're trying to get out of the office now. I mean, they have really a great concern about Chinese behavior. And I think the Chinese need to look in the mirror and decide whether this is the relationship they want. To be sure, one should respect history. And the history of Chinese neighbors is a history of tributary states. And I don't think they're quite willing to accept those states as sovereign equals. I mean, even in Europe, which has had a lot more experience with sovereign equals, they've had a tough time too. I mean, you should see what I used to talk to the Poles about when they first come to the European Union. Everyone's the same, and they would escort the Poles down to the left of the salt and pepper shakers, and the Poles said, wait a minute, we want to sit in the middle of the table. And so there's pecking orders everywhere, but I'm saying I think it's very serious in China. How we handle this, we need to be calm, and calmness is a good idea. We need to listen as much as we're talking, and certainly avoid the shouting. But we also need to work on our example, because I think that will help help where we are. And I might add, by the way, even despite our problems, China is not making any new friends in the world. So
they're actually probably losing more friends these days
Yeah.
because of this new policy, and to the point about the political challenges that they face internally. Hong Kong is a really good example of, I think, the fundamental nature of human beings who will do everything they can, despite whatever constraints, to exercise maximum individual freedom. And the people of Hong Kong did that to the extent that they could before basically the Chinese government came down on them with both
Yeah,
feet.
yeah.
And it's a good end, and the fear was that if this movement within Hong Kong would begin to snowball, they might be seeing it elsewhere in China, and then they've got real problems.
I think where we need to be calm, where we need to be careful is in Taiwan. Because the situation there, we have had a policy going back to Henry Kissinger and to a Kissingerian phrase, which was creative ambiguity. No one really knew what we would do if the Chinese pushed on Taiwan. And there is a view, and you hear it a lot in recent years, that creative ambiguity has deteriorated and that the Chinese have reason to believe that we would not come to the rescue of Taiwan. And so the antidote to this was, let's increase the notion that maybe we would. The trouble with that, and I understand it, you're trying to reestablish this ambiguity. So right now people think, no, they're not going to ever help, so therefore we have to suggest that maybe we would, and then you get back to equilibrium on this ambiguity. The problem is when you look at issues like that, you have to ask yourself, who controls the escalation? If they do this, we do that, they do that, we do this again? Do we do something else? And so you have to, not to trivialize it with chess or something, you better know what comes at the end of this. And if you don't feel that you have the control the escalation, that ultimately the other side will say, well, ultimately they'll do this and we don't want to get involved in that, therefore we're going to stop. That is the issue, and I think we've got to be real careful. And I am not satisfied that we have enough of an understanding of how the Chinese leadership, I'm not just talking about Xi Jinping, but there's a whole leadership there. They've abandoned a whole succession system, and you have to ask yourself why, because the succession system was kind of working out. So why did they do that? And so you have to worry how, as a polity, how as a regime, would they react to being pushed a little on Taiwan? We're already seeing rather vicious-looking overflights by strike aircraft in Taiwan. And we're seeing an extraordinary capacity to build up a military, which seems to go beyond China's needs in its littoral. So I think China is a very serious problem, but we really need to think it through and think through how we're going to work with them, and what's the role of military cooperation, what's the role of economic support, because the Trump administration essentially ignored international things like the World Trade Organization and various remedies you could use for, when one country dumps products on another country. So we need to kind of leverage our position and look at international organizations, look at good allies, and look at other ways that China will understand that if they try to control the escalation, they will do so in a way that makes them isolated. I think, however, and I'll stop because I know I've been riffing on too much about China, but the Trump administration started this. Actually, it was started during the Obama administration. The Trump administration picked it up. The Biden administration continues it. And that is that those of us who went to elementary school and had to learn what are the world's oceans, we'd see, well, there's an Indian Ocean, there's a Pacific Ocean, they seem to be separate oceans, there's an Atlantic. Well, now we talk about the Indo-Pacific. And what are we doing with that? Are we changing our elementary school geography class? Or are we doing something else? Are we saying that somehow, against 1,000 years of history, we can bring India into the equation in Pacific, and that somehow this will create an encircling feeling that the Chinese might have, and they might think, gosh, you know, if India's there, they're big, and then you've got the US and Japan, and we better start behaving ourselves a little better. You know, I understand it, but that's usually not how countries react to encirclement. And if you go back to the Shanghai Accords, I think one of the great events. Why is it one of the great events? Because it essentially ended the Soviet Union. 1972 was when Soviet foreign policy essentially collapsed. And what had happened was the Soviets playing games with the Vietnamese, playing games with the Indians, playing games all over, trying to create a kind of encirclement of China. And what did China do? They reached out to us. And the world's never been the same. We need to understand these things. We need to take time, think them through, and understand that China is going to be around for a long time. I think we are too. And I am not one of these declinists. I think our country, I mean, you tell me someone's going to replace us, tell me by whom. But we need to think this through, because I don't think, information is not knowledge, and knowledge sure as heck is not wisdom, and we need some of the last category. So, thank you. I think we're probably supposed to get to questions pretty soon.
Are we supposed to move to the Q&A here?
We haven't really talked about European allies. Maybe a word or two about our European allies, because I think they're good allies. And
they're our best allies.
They're our best allies. Well, I like the.
I mean, we got Japan and South Korea, and Australia, and so forth.
I mean, we'd like Japan and South Korea to work more together. And again, I think it's more leveraging. We can do it. It's more subtle. It's not like saying India is a Pacific country. But I think we need South Korea and Japan, who are just so burdened by their history, to try to work through that and be a part of Northeast Asia, which exports not instability, but rather electric cars and stuff. So I think that it has to be an effort of our policy, is to try to get those two countries to do better together. And in Europe, I think we need to understand that it cannot be outsourced to the European Union. It cannot be outsourced to European partners. There is a belt of autocracies growing there, and we need to take notice, and we need to be involved in the solution, and not pretend that we have to just have the Europeans take it over. I do believe we need to remain. I think NATO is an absolutely crucial organization, but that's the military, and I think we need to be very engaged diplomatically as well, and that is why I was so pleased with with President Biden's trip to Europe.
G7. Yeah. I think when people talk, when you compare the United States and China, they first turn to obviously to economic prowess, and there's no question of the great strides that China has made, and not only just in their economy, but in technology. But China will inevitably pass the United States. This is just inevitable given the size of its country. But it's important to recall that in the early 19th century, China also had the largest economy in the world. Having the largest economy does not guarantee survival or continued power or influence in the world. The second thing I would point out is, and this is where the United States, when you refer to our allies and friends around the world, enjoys incomparable advantage that China has no expectation of reaching. How many allies does China have in the world? Okay, North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, then you have to dig kind of deep after that. Russia, well, maybe today, but tomorrow you can't be sure. How many does the United States have? Probably between 60 and 70 at least. That is, allies with whom we have agreements, understanding, formal alliances, and strengthening those alliances, which is something the previous administration did not do, and in fact seemed to set out to weaken them, is basically playing to our comparative advantage. When we can turn to our allies for the support that we need to advance all of our collective interests, it serves us. It's not an exercise in altruism. And moreover, just to carry it more broadly, multilateralism is often criticized. It's a bad word they don't want to use. But in fact, that's how you solve diplomatic problems. When you can't solve them, talking to the other side, you turn to the WTO or to the UN or to some other international organization to begin to lay some basic groundwork where you can resolve disputes and move forward on issues. And this is something that I think, in fact, I'm confident this administration is committed to doing, and they as much as said that at the G7 and at the NATO summits.
Yeah.
So.
Claire?
This first question comes from Richard Dangler, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. He was the USAID Special Advisor for monitoring major infrastructure development in Iraq as well as in Kosovo. So I think his career dovetailed yours in a few locations.
Sure did, yeah.
So this circles back to Afghanistan, and he asked, do you believe the Taliban wants peace? And if so, does Afghanistan have a non-corrupt government with whom to negotiate?
Yeah. Even at a distance, he's asking the right questions. He always does. I think there are elements of the Taliban that do want peace and don't want to go back to their first effort at power, but I think there are a lot of them who are just very full of revenge, and I think it's going to be a very difficult process. So I would not feel that we should trust the Taliban in any way, shape, or form. I think, though, the Afghans need to understand that we've done a lot over the years. And by the way, we brought a lot of NATO allies there, too. It wasn't just us. And I think it's time for, they need to show that they care as much as many of us have cared about that.
Okay, I'll just remind everybody, if you have a question, raise your hand. Try to keep the mic here. Don't put it here. It doesn't work. Try to keep it up there. Try to keep your questions concise. Pete?
Follow up to that. Why are the Pakistanis so supportive of the Taliban?
I think the Pakistanis, I'm going to turn it over to Gary on this, but I really think the Pakistanis continue to think that playing with these radical groups is their way of putting pressure on India and places like Kashmir. And I think they have a very, very narrow view of things. And I think that it's, they just don't believe in us as an ally. They think these groups can be more leveraging for them.
In addition, I think the Pakistanis interpreted our strong presence in Afghanistan, as well as the warming relationship with India as a potential threat, and therefore allied themselves with the ones most able to confront that, and that was the Taliban. There are also some tribal affiliations. The Taliban is overwhelmingly Pashtun. The Pashtuns are the largest ethnic group within Afghanistan. It's about 40-odd% of the population. The next largest group is down to 27. And so they now feel, Pakistan, that they're sort of back in the catbird seat. But my own personal view is that's going to be short-lived because of the instability that's now going to be created. Yeah. And that probably is a more positive outcome given some of the reports that we're hearing of what's happening.
I think, India has outgrown Pakistan. India is engaged everywhere, but Pakistan's not outgrown India.
Yeah.
And I think they have sadly made use of these radical Islamic groups in the frustration of dealing with Hindu in India.
They'd be wise to look at the Saudi example and the alliances and the ideology that they espouse that led to the creation of groups that are now reviled around the world, like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State.
Yeah.
So back to China. Thank you. I have read a few articles recently that talks about how the Chinese average worker's wage has gone up something like 1,400% in the last few decades, and how about 30% of their manufacturing is planning on leaving, like Nike, Samsung are planning on leaving China in the next couple of years. So knowing China always plans way ahead what they're going to do you think that has anything to do with their military movements? Also, where do you think they're going to be shifting if they lose a third of their manufacturing? That's going to affect their economy, and how will that affect their political stability of their current government?
I think they're very worried about precisely what you're talking about, and it's called in economic terms the middle income trap. And that is why, their approach to this is to go really hard on high tech and try to slide out of that middle income trap. I don't think it's so directly related to the military buildup. I think that is other dynamics of the kind I described. But I think their concern about getting into a stagnant period, you notice as well, they, long after demographers told them to do this, they finally, gotten rid of the one-child policy because that has been killing them. I mean, demographers have an expression that if you're, you better get rich before you get old. And Japan succeeded in doing that. Korea just made it because the population's aging, but they're a wealthy country. China's not there yet. So I think there are a lot of demographic trends that certainly don't support the notion that we hear too often in this country that the Chinese are 10 feet tall, 10 feet high, and they're going to blow us away, et cetera. I mean, I think they have a lot of problems, and I mentioned their political problems, but I think this middle income trap is a big problem for them, and they need to get serious about dealing with it rather than just having more and more authoritarian control.
And they've just about run out of the maximizing the export component of their economy now. I mean, they'll always be a major exporter just because of the size of their economy. But if they're going to continue the successful growth and raising the living standard in China, they're going to have to start looking at Chinese consumers and manufacturing to meet the needs
They've
of
inflated
Chinese.
domestic demand. They've done a lot to inflate domestic demand, but because of some of these dynamics. But I think you're seeing China really trying to do what Japan and Korea did, which is go on onto high tech. And but when they do it, unlike the Koreans, in Korea you may have a few Hyundais coming into this economy, but in China, I mean, it's much bigger. I mean, what they're doing with trying to develop electric cars, trying to develop solar power. I mean, they really are trying to stay ahead of it. They're good manufacturers. They're very good, and we need to respect that. The problem is they haven't played by the rules, and moreover, any economist will tell you bilateral deficits don't matter. Well, that's wonderful, except that they do. I mean, people, when you see that, you're being thrown out of work because of all kinds of technological things, and then you look at China running a huge surplus against the US, you bet it matters. It's just politically unsustainable. And I think the Chinese need to understand. The Japanese figured that out early on. The Japanese realized, look, we can't be flooding into the U.S. and having this trade surplus with them, because sooner or later they're going to come after us, the Japanese. But Japan doesn't have a military to speak of. They managed that, and we managed it with them. When China doesn't make this pivot away from high surpluses with us, we get very worried about it because they are aspiring to a bigger role in the world than the Japanese and Koreans are. But to understand Chinese economy, just putting aside the politics of it, look at Korea and Japan in the 1980s. A lot of similarities.
Hi, back to Afghanistan. In the prior administration, the U.S. led bilateral negotiations with the Taliban, bypassing the Afghan government. What lasting impact do you think that's had on the Taliban's relationship with the Afghan government and the current balance of power?
You know, I would say in this kind of game, you know, I like to think trust isn't a main factor in many aspects of foreign policy. I remember someone asked me, you know, how can you trust the North Koreans? And I said, well, let me paraphrase Tina Turner, what's trust got to do with it? Because, you know, it's really all about, you know, verification, et cetera. But the issue that you raised is absolutely related to trust, and I think it was a big mistake. It doesn't mean it's easy to bring the Kabul government into it, and in fact the Taliban objected to their presence, and this is the kind, you know, North Koreans object to South Korean presence at things, you know, this is what they do, but I think it's fair to say it was not the right approach because of this, the deleterious effect it had on trust. And, you know, I mean, Napoleon once said, hey, my greatest strength is that I have no allies. And I understand what Napoleon meant. I mean, allies can be a difficult process, having alliances, but I think we should have done better on that, and I think we're paying some of the price right now.
I'd like to turn to Israel and Palestine. I'm only a master's person in international relations and politics.
Oh, then sit down.
Not a specialist. I'm in the company of masters, I know.
Barely.
But in my lay opinion, although there are many keys to solving the problem of Israel and Palestine, Hamas to me is the key issue.
Hamas?
Hamas.
Yeah.
One, do you agree with that? Two, would you comment on, do you ever think that the people in Gaza are ever going to stop suffering the carnage they suffer and turn against Hamas, or is the grip that Hamas has on the population so strong that that's not possible? And number three, what can we do to diminish the power of Hamas and their ability to be a thorn in this whole terrible situation?
There is no one key issue in that, and believe me, if there were, we probably would have solved it. Hamas is a very problematic issue because it effectively divides the Palestinian people and presents, in many ways, Israel with a ready-made excuse, which happens to be true. They have no one to negotiate with because half the Palestinians at the negotiating table would not be represented since Hamas would not be invited. So this presents an obstacle, and right now there's no way around it. Israel has avoided going into Gaza and attempting to eradicate Hamas. It probably has the power to do it, and particularly if they were to get outside help. And by the way, many Arab governments would be standing and cheering them on. Hamas does not have very many friends in the Arab world. The Iranians like them. The Qataris sort of are there for them, and they write the checks, which is in itself a problem as well. So I don't see any escape, sadly, for the people of Gaza, because they lack the wherewithal to rise up against the Hamas masters. They have lost whatever power and influence they have. They are hostages. They are hostages for use by Hamas against Israel. And Hamas will look for every opportunity to leverage the military power it's able to build in order to sort of modulate its popularity. Many times Hamas has enjoyed much more popularity in the West Bank, where it's barely represented at all, than it is in Gaza, because the people in Gaza experience Hamas firsthand. I don't see any near-term solution to the problem of Hamas, particularly when we know that they're getting support from Hezbollah and from Iran Qatar,
Yeah.
we could probably influence, but the Qataris provide considerable amount of humanitarian aid. That we
But I
know
mean,
that
if
the
you're
Gazans need.
if you're sitting in the secretary's office and the secretary says, I want to see a strategy for undermining Hamas's authority in Gaza, it seems to me some of the elements of it, you would try to interdict some of this support, which includes coming from Iran. And probably at this point, that's the lion's share, because probably the Saudis have restricted, well, they haven't restricted the Qatari, but they're you could probably get Turkey to restrict some Qatari money to Hamas. You could probably work that end. And then could you have a situation where you find someone else willing to take on the humanitarian chores there, whether it's Saudi money or, our money or somebody's money, and you somehow start trying to take Hamas away from the idea that they keep people fed and clothed. I mean, isn't that the problem? Hamas is essentially allowed to, with thuggish tactics, sort of control all the, the disbursement of assistance.
We've tried, there is no shortage of countries who are willing to support the people of Gaza,
Yeah.
including the United States,
Yeah.
and the United Nations and Saudi Arabia and other countries. Where the frustration comes is that because Hamas controls what goes into that country, literally everything that goes into that country is controlled by Hamas. This is after it gets through Israel, which is no mean task. But it can. Israel does approve certain items going into the country. But we tried so many ways to monitor the goods, including construction materials, to rebuild the schools and homes and hospitals and roads and so forth that get damaged during these conflicts. And then at the end of the day, when we tally it all up, we find out, wait, there's an imbalance here. There should be so many roads built, schools and hospitals, and there are fewer of all of those. So where did the rest go?
Yeah.
Tunnels. And purchasing weapons and so forth, because they control the black market. You'd probably be very challenged to find a place in the world where a small region and a group of people is so firmly controlled by a single group, and it's through the thuggish tactics. By the way, there's a bit of thuggery also going on, not nearly the extent it is in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. So
with Fatah.
with Fatah
Yeah.
and Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority, now into his 16th year before your term, having canceled the elections that were supposed to take place in first May, and then this month, and then next month. So there is a lot of frustration and angst on the part of the Palestinians, which is why when the last round of violence broke out, we saw the people in Jerusalem out in the streets marching against the Israelis. And that was all held in check for the most part. Both sides did a lot of things that probably were unwise, but given the emotions involved, understandable, until Hamas saw a golden opportunity to leverage those incidents to elevate its own political profile and put Israel on notice that if they did not stop all the things they were doing in Jerusalem, that they would begin to launch rockets. And even before Israel could make a decision, and we know what Israel was going to do, they started launching rockets, including at Jerusalem, which they'd never done before. So I think it's just an example of how influential Hamas can be through the pure exercise of power, mostly armed power.
On that Israeli-Palestinian topic, isn't there a much more fundamental problem that no one seems to be interested in, and that is the honest pursuit of a two-state solution? Because that is the only way that both Israel and Palestine will be preserved for their own people. What do you think?
Well, you need more than just people who want the peace. In this case, one that would involve a two-state solution. You need the conditions for it. And the conditions today certainly among the Palestinians, are simply not there. The Palestinian government, I'm talking about the Palestinian Authority out of Ramallah in the West Bank, has no popular support whatsoever. So there is no way that Abu Mazen is going to enter into any type of negotiation, if he could, with the Israelis, because Palestinian people wouldn't accept it, because they no longer recognize him as a legitimate decision maker for the Palestinian people. This is why they took to the streets in Jerusalem. So yes, there are many people who want a two-state solution, but I have to say that number is declining in Israel, and most definitely in the Palestinian territories. It's not that they wouldn't like to have it, they see very little hope of getting it. I mean, it's still in the 30 to 40% category, but there are a lot of people among the Palestinians who believe that now it's going to be a one-state solution. It's not one big Palestine. Okay, if it's going to be Israel in charge of everything, a genuine one-state solution, then we, the Palestinians, enjoy the same rights as every Jewish Israeli. And that's not something that Israel is going to accept.
So they would outnumber them.
They would, if not outnumber them, at least it would be almost a 50-50 balance at this point when you add up all the various numbers. And it's too risky for the Israelis. And one other, if you want an example of why the one-state solution is not going to work, look what happened in this latest round of violence between Israel and Hamas. We saw Arab Israelis taking to the streets and rioting and demonstrating and threatening the lives of other Israelis in multiple cities throughout Israel, something they had never, ever seen before. To me, it was the greatest illustration of the unworkability of a one-state solution, unless you give equal rights to everyone. And it's not clear that the Israelis would be prepared to do that. So two-state is the way, but now we don't have the conditions for it on either side, really.
What are Putin's goals and end game for allowing, supporting, perhaps funding and directing cyber attacks against various aspects of our economy and infrastructure? What are we and can we, what are we doing about it, and what can we do about it? And are we doing any of the similar things to them?
Yeah. You mean, well,
And that's going to take us to the end.
yeah, I mean, the country that is, of course, and we all know it, the country that has got the most capabilities is Russia. And I think Biden has already put Putin on notice. It seems to be continuing, although, you know, Putin may be saying, I have nothing to do with it, and if it stopped, it would look like he sure had something to do with it. That said, I said the country with the most capabilities is Russia. That's not true. The country with the most capabilities is this country, the United States. And I think we're in a strong position to demand some rules of the road. Some of the problems, I think, have to do with, you know, the technology is not there to, you know, have a signature of who instituted the attack. I mean, if there were a nuclear detonation somewhere, we'd know exactly where it comes from. We know the signature of, we know which you know, facility in the world this fissile material came from. That's not successful. We don't have that technology yet in terms of cyber, but I think that will be a big effort to try to be able to identify more clearly where this is coming from. I think coming up with some international rules of the road will be essential, but I think ultimately, if we know where it's coming from, we can certainly make that country regret that it did it. So. And sadly, I think that may be the way that this is finally dealt with. You know, there's something, you know, China is a rising power, and it does play the long game. You know, it's increasingly problematic in the short game, but it's got some stake in where this world is heading. Russia is a declining power, and as such, I think is a far more dangerous power. And we're seeing this in these sort of asymmetric weapons, such as cyber attacks. We're also seeing this in a kind of weak state structure where you have all kinds of actors out there spread across Russia. So, people talk about, how do we make this a less corrupt world and all of these things. Well, corruption, I know this from the Peace Corps. When I was in the Peace Corps, I had credit unions that had corruption and credit unions that didn't. And what was the difference? It wasn't that the ones with corruption had bad people and the other ones had good people. It had to do with the quality of the institutions, the quality of the financial management, the quality of the cash system. Treasurers didn't touch cash, bookkeepers didn't touch cash, things like that. It's about developing institutions. And we live in a world where everyone is knocking every institution. And when you knock institutions, when you drag them down, you're going to get people taking their own things into their own hands, and that's called corruption, and it's called governments that are simply out of control of their people. So I think a lot of what needs to be done in this world of ours is to strengthen these institutions, support them, and stop running them down all the time. Because if you don't have good institutions, you're going to have more corruption, and you're going to have more wayward states like Russia.
Chris, your point that you made earlier about the second and third order effects of escalation is very much on the minds of this administration when it comes to cyber and cyber attacks. There's no question the United States can exact devastating attacks on both the Russian and the Chinese economies if we chose to do so. I have a friend who worked in the NSA and was not allowed to get into details, but they pretty much have access to all the systems they need in those countries, including, in the case of Russia, critical infrastructure, which is oil and the flow of oil. We could shut it down. But I think, as you said, Chris, that we're very much concerned that if we respond in kind to a cyber attack in that fashion, then Russia does something else.
Who's going to control that?
And then who starts controlling it? And then when does China start getting really nervous and say, when do the Americans turn to us? Look what they've done to the Russians. And by the way, we're very dependent on that oil. So I think this is why the administration successfully was able to persuade Putin, let's see if he actually takes action now, doesn't seem so, at least in the initial stages, that we start talking about some basic negotiations of putting certain sectors off limits when it comes to cyber. There's always going to be, that's always out there. Now, this is going to be a fact of life going forward, just as espionage was. But we ought to be able to put some sectors aside.
And if I could just make one point, it's not a major point, but when these things happen, you often have people saying, well, you should declassify the information that you've got. And if you declassify the information, everyone will say, aha, they really did it. Thank you for declassifying. It doesn't work that way. First of all, they deny it anyway. And secondly, when you declassify something that you have spent years, capabilities that you've spent years to develop, whether it's HUMINT or SIGINT or something, you just declassify it because you want to look good on the evening news, you will put yourself way behind. You will be in far worse trouble. So when people say, well, they should just declassify the information that says that the Russians did this, be very wary of that kind of thing, because it is often just nonsense and it doesn't lead to any solution. So I think we've covered the whole world.
Left out our good friends, Canada and Mexico.
Yeah. But hey, if you have kids or grandkids who are thinking, gee, should I join the Foreign Service? The answer is yes. And it's not just that our country is back, but I think our diplomacy, this concept that we live here in the world with everyone else, and we're not going to be successful with diplomacy unless we have some diplomats. So, if, you meet some kid out there who says he's thinking about it, you twist his arm till he takes the Foreign Service exam and passes. Thank you very much. All right.